This second day of coverage on the hours, I'm going to call the story of three kisses, or you could say the story of three parties. But I think the kisses um, aspect is probably the more prominent and the more significant in the novel. I have here the three different stories within this novel. Right, so we have Clarissa Vaughn, and Laura Brown, and then Virginia Woolf, who was, writing Mrs. Dalloway. And I think that this, the Hours really elaborates on this idea of the kiss, which is a very central um, topic or theme in the original Mrs. Dalloway novel. And it's one of those that really reflects Woolf's idea in writing the novel of trying to grasp um, a single day, a woman's whole life in a single day. And that kiss that Clarissa Dalloway has in her very young life is something that stays with her. She's thinking about it all the way, at the very end of the novel. And so it was a moment of great happiness for her. And so we have some parallel developments here with three stories in the Hours with Clarissa, who is remembering the kiss with Richard from her youth, which is very much parallel um, to what happens in the Mrs. Dalloway novel. But we have all three of these characters participate in a kind of a process that involves a kiss, a very significant kiss, a very unusual, surprising kiss in a way that we'll talk about later. Each of them is preparing for a party of some kind. And that goes along with Mrs. Dalloway's story too. I mean, she is a hostess, as they say, and their whole novel is about getting ready for the party. And so each of these three, in a way that is rather natural for someone who was giving a party, um, they're feeling uncertain of themselves. They want the party to succeed. They want things to come off. They want themselves to look good. So they're second guessing themselves in a way. And these tend to bring on, thoughts of insignificance. And so this is something they all three have in common. Now let's start with Clarissa and go into a little more detail. All right, so the kiss with Richard, again, it's not, I mean, the other two women, actually, the kiss happens on the spur of the moment, but this one is remembered just like what happens in Mrs. Dalloway in the novel, where Clarissa is remembering that past kiss. And here in the Hours, Richard actually, at that moment, this is the first time he calls her Mrs. Dalloway, at least that's the way it's recorded in the novel. And this is a nickname that sticks with her, for their entire lives. So that's the closest parallel. And clearly, she is preparing for the party for Richard that evening. But in this period of preparation, she does experience these feelings of insignificance. Remembering a passage that's on page 94 where she is talking about herself being trivial, endlessly trivial, it says. And this is another theme that we find in Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway, where people think that she is sometimes shallow, or that her parties that she likes to give are silly. And so this makes her, she feels kind of defensive about that. And Clarissa Vaughn here has many of the same types of feelings, not knowing why people criticize her. Now, for each of the three stories, I do have thoughts of suicide listed last on in this little bullet list here. And, looking through it again, Clarissa is not really participating in thoughts of suicide. But I think that, Richard is the one who does actually commit suicide in the Hours. And, the whole point in Mrs. Dalloway Wolfe's novel is that Clarissa, who has been thinking about death and whether or not it's worth it to keep on going, she is the one who, in the end, who does. So Clarissa Vaughan, in The Hours, um, she seems to be one that does not really go down that road, but it's Richard who does instead. For each of the three women, I've included the passage in the novel where they talk about their particular kiss. I mean, not about the party preparations or the feelings of insignificance, but just to look at the kiss that they remember or that they have by itself. The scans that I include here, some of them didn't really come out all that well, so I apologize in advance. But here we have a rather long passage, and I'm just going to just highlight these first couple lines here. That summer when she was 18, it seemed anything could happen, anything at all. It was the house and the weather, the ecstatic unreality of it all that helped turn Richard's friendship into a more devouring kind of love. And there's another passage that maybe I should have included this one instead on the bottom of page 97. But I'm trying not to, paste in too many slides of text. But let me just read part of this here. So at the bottom of 97, it says, and this is Clarissa reflecting on the situation. She says, she thinks, still, there is a sense of missed opportunity. Maybe there is nothing ever that can equal the recollection of having been young together. Maybe it's as simple as that. Richard was the person Clarissa loved at her most optimistic moment. So I think that's something, and we're going to come back a little bit later after we go through all three and talk about, what the significance of each of the three kisses is, or what they mean, to the person. In Laura Brown's part of the story, she too is preparing for a party, but not nearly something as elaborate as the one that Clarissa is preparing for Richard. It's her husband's birthday, and she wants to make a cake, and she has got him a few presents. So it's just going to be a party of her and her husband and Richie. In the process, though, of her deliberations during the day and her preparations, her neighbor Kitty comes in, and this is a very kind of I think a surprising thing, and I don't know how many of you may have seen the film, which again I would recommend because it's really good. But in this passage, it is kind of surprising and a bit more sensual than the way it's described in the book. But we'll take a look at that passage in just a minute. But Laura, as we've said earlier, is depressed. She seems to have a hard time doing just about anything, and the idea of baking a cake seems to be an obstacle that, it's described as being almost insurmountable. It gets to a point where even Richie, who is 3 years old, says, "Mommy, it's not that difficult to bake a cake." And when Kitty comes in, she also says, "Oh, Laura, I don't know why you have so much trouble with baking a cake. Anybody can make a cake." But the failed cake is really the trigger that kind of makes her begin to experience these feelings of insignificance. It's not just about the cake. It's about other things, why her husband seems to be able to take everything so well, and why she finds things so difficult. Just before Kitty knocks on the door and visits, Laura is experiencing thoughts of suicide, but not in a very urgent way. She's remembering, she's reading Virginia Woolf's book, Mrs. Dalloway, of course, and she's remembering on page 101, it says, Virginia Woolf put a stone into the pocket of her coat, walked into a river, and drowned. Laura will not let herself go morbid. She'll make the beds, vacuum, cook the birthday dinner. So she's trying to brush off feelings of thoughts of suicide. And then after the long or the conversation with Kitty, and then she makes another cake, and then we see her driving away, and she pulls into a hotel for a couple of hours. She is having other thoughts about suicide, and this is on page 152. And after having considered briefly, the idea of, committing suicide in a hotel room would be something that could be easy to do, but then she shakes it off again. She strokes her belly. It says on 152, I would never. She says the words out loud in a clean, silent room. I would never. So she makes that choice not to indulge in those thoughts, and kind of surprised too. Like in the film version that I referred to, they make much more of Laura's scene here with, and it's really kind of a surrealistic thing where she's in the room, and she's actually taking pills. She's got a purse full of pills that she took from the medicine cabinet in her house, and it really looks like it's leading up to her choosing. And then when she decides not to, she just breaks down in tears. So it's a very kind of different interpretation. Getting back to the kiss with Kitty, I've kind of marked it in my book so you can see what areas I'm looking at. But even before this, when she first arrives, when she knocks on the door, it describes Laura as she says, Laura swallows a pang of excitement and something stronger than excitement. So the idea of there being sexual attraction of some kind before the moment of the kiss, I think is implied pretty well. So, and then it seems to kind of come over her without her really planning on this. Kitty is, has to go to the hospital, and so Laura is really concerned about her. But this kind of leads her to an emotional moment where they embrace, and then at the top here, without quite meaning to, without deciding to, she kisses Kitty lingeringly on the top of her forehead. She is full of Kitty's perfume and the crisp, clean essence of Kitty's brown blonde hair. And then down below, Kitty lifts her face and their lips touch. They both know what they are doing. They rest their mouths each on the other. They touch their lips together, but do not quite kiss. So it's kind of ambiguous in a way, but there's no denying that there is a sexual tension, and I think going both ways. The third kiss, the third part of the story, the kiss happens between Virginia and her sister Vanessa, which is kind of unusual. And once again, in the novel, it's not a lot. We'll take a look at the passage in a minute. But in the film, they make much more out of it. I mean, they make it look like, and I think it works pretty effectively, but Virginia is really desperate because she wants to go back to London. She wants to have a life, and she's almost like, trying to suck the life out of Vanessa's face when you see it in the film. Here it's meaningful, but not as dramatic. In this case, the parallel is maybe not quite so strong because there isn't, I said there's 3 parties, and it's not so much a party here, but Vanessa and her children are visiting, and they've been invited for tea, and they've come an hour and a half early, which creates something of a little mess in terms of the family dynamics. But she is preparing tea, and when Vanessa comes early, this really throws Virginia off, and she does spend some time, but in the time between when Vanessa and the kids are announced and the time that they actually see each other, Virginia is kind of not so much in a panic, but she does start having feelings of insignificance. She said, "Oh, if I had known she was going to be here early, I would have done something with my hair. I would have put on a better dress." They're feelings that are not that different than what Laura Brown was feeling. And then when, if you remember that, they find that the children find a bird that's been injured and well, it's dying, and there's a place that they prepare a funeral for this bird, and eventually they leave it out there, and it dies. But Virginia is looking at it very closely and has a couple of moments of wanting to trade places with the bird. On page 121, it says, after they've left the bird, it says, Virginia lingers another moment beside the dead bird in its circle of roses. She would like to lie down in its place. No denying it, she would like that. Yikes. So here is the passage with the kiss. Nellie, she's the cook. Nellie turns away, and although it is not at all their custom, Virginia leans forward and kisses Vanessa on the mouth. It is an innocent kiss, innocent enough, but just now, in this kitchen behind Nellie's back, it feels like the most delicious and forbidden of pleasures. Vanessa returns the kiss. So I kind of like to return to the question of, what these three kisses, I think, mean different things to each of the three women. If we go back to Clarissa Vaughan's kiss, it's much more like the experience of Virginia Woolf, where it's a moment from her early life that has brought her a unique, a surprising kind of happiness, and it makes her look forward to life. But in looking back, it's almost as if, and I think this is for both Clarissas, that looking for what she was looking forward to, the happiness that she was looking forward to, never really happened. It was really that moment was the moment of happiness. For Laura Brown, I think it's very different. It doesn't really have to do with a moment of happiness, but a moment of satisfying of a secret desire that, in that kind of heteronormative society, this is something that she has maybe not even been able to admit to herself, that she has felt this desire for another woman. So it's an opportunity of expression that brings her some satisfaction. For Virginia, it seems that Vanessa is her lifeline to the life in London that she wants so much. And so the connection of the kiss is indicative of her attempts to get back to that London life. Before moving on, I wanted to say a little bit about the sexual ambiguity that shows up in this novel. I mean, Mrs. Dalloway, Woolf's novel, and some of her other novels too, are kind of famous for their sexual ambiguity. Woolf, having been attracted to women, herself, even though she was married to Leonard Woolf, she has in Mrs. Dalloway this ambiguous thing. Well, Clarissa Dalloway is married to Richard. She was courted by Peter Walsh, but she had this past experience, this past kiss with Sally Seton. And so in England, in the 1920s, it seems to be not just ambiguous, but somewhat bold, somewhat daring to include that in a novel. And in the very late 20th century, where Michael Cunningham was writing this, his novel is not really nearly surprising, but he I think he wants to take the sexual ambiguity that was in Woolf's novel and elaborate on it. And this is one of the ways where I mentioned earlier that he seems to invert certain things in terms of gender issues. Things are a little bit skewed, or he takes things as if it's going in a parallel way with Mrs. Dalloway, and then it takes a sudden left turn somewhere else. So I think that these three kisses are indicative of that, because you have, for example, with Clarissa and Richard. Clarissa Vaughn and Richard, these are two people who have kind of settled on a homosexual lifestyle, although clearly I think with both of them, they have had relationships with the other sex. And then with Laura Brown, you have the situation with two women who identify as heterosexual who have this momentary homosexual kiss experience. And then in the last one, you have the kiss between two sisters, which again is one wants to ask, what is going on here? What kind of sexual desire is being expressed? So as a way of just wrapping up here, the three women and the three kisses that we've been going through here, right? So and are all experiences that originally were in Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway. And so this is what is how Michael Cunningham in The Hours is paralleling the experience of Mrs. Dalloway, but also elaborating on it in a way that includes a similar kind of process with three different characters. So just by way of review, Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa, remembers this kiss with Sally, and it has been sort of an enduring part of her memory over the years. She is preparing for the party, which is sort of the whole target of the plot. And then all through the novel, she's going through these feelings of insignificance, feeling like some people feel that her parties are silly, that she is shallow. And then, of course, she has experienced on several occasions in that novel thoughts of suicide, but in the end decides to choose life.